might make a start, everybody. I'm just going to step out of the way of the blinding blue light. So my name's Lauren Rickards. I am the Director of the Urban Futures Enabling Impact platform. And it's my pleasure to be here today to welcome you to what is the first event in the Urban Futures Atmospheric Futures HDR Symposium for 2023. So each year HDR students need to do milestones, and with DSC we've collaborated to bring these together into a week-long dialogue, a celebration of intellectual work. And to add to that, to add to the celebration of HDR work, we have a number of events, and this year we're looking at this question of atmospheres as a kind of boundary object, something that's worked on from across the universities. So for those of you who don't know, the EIPs, Enabling Impact Platforms, are designed to bring together researchers from across the colleges and disciplines of the university to work on real-world problems and create real-world positive impact. And so I'm particularly excited to be here talking about an area that needs some real-world problem solving, which is this question of atmospheres. And I say that as someone who's working on the highly related topic of climate change that we'll hear about today as well. So I should say that I want to acknowledge, of course, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land, waters and in whose air we are working here in the university, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So as I said, this is part of the Urban Futures Symposium. If I could just jump ahead from today, just to give you a little plug of just two other events that are coming up. First of all, Thursday evening, so tomorrow, good heavens, Thursday, tomorrow online from the comfort of your own kitchen or living room, you can listen to this really fascinating work on cultivating future urban atmospheres, which is all about the increasingly extreme lengths some groups are going to control and interiorize environments and atmospheres in order to optimize production and securitize survival. And that's with Simon Marmon, who's a very well-known urban theorist. Then on Friday, we stretched the metaphor of atmospheres to look at vacuums. And we're lucky to have three brilliant young female scholars talking about different sorts of approaches to this idea that's at the heart of all research, but particularly HDR theses, the knowledge gap, and thinking about the ways in which sometimes those gaps are not necessarily what they seem. It might not just be that there literally isn't knowledge on it, it might be that the knowledge is unseen, unaccessible, or simply not responsive to your particular search terms in Google. So we'll be looking at that. But today we're here to enjoy the luxury of conversation across disciplines, schools and colleges about this question of atmospheres. Now, atmosphere is something we don't often think about, and that's partly because it's generally not visible, and it's generally something that is something that we in this privileged environment that we're in, we don't need to think about. And just to kind of illustrate the controlled nature, but also the co-created nature, I would like to just record here at the start that we have carbon dioxide levels of 591. I won't write that down because people remember carbon dioxide at 591 at the start of the panel. And we'll see how our magical systems go at controlling that for us. And because we had issues with temperature before, let's also note that it's 25.09 degrees. So, but the fact that we have machines managing that is part of this, the luxury of not having to think about atmospheres. But of course, many people around the world do have to take air and atmospheres seriously, as we'll hear about today. But also, it's not just a matter of survival, it's a matter of qualities of life, not just quality of life. So we're going to hear about all sorts of ways that atmospheres are researched and investigated across the different disciplines. One of the things I'm really, I guess, hoping to do this is not just that you all walk out of here thinking, atmospheres, interesting, but actually that you reflect more broadly on this question of the ways in which we approach common things differently. And so that is the crux of kind of disciplinary difference, if you like. Not just that we look at different aspects of things, but we look at things in different ways. And so we're really going to be drawing out today the different scales, the different methods, the different aspects of atmospheres that people look at across different areas. And one of the reasons that's important is, of course, that it's only in doing so that we're able to really genuinely succeed, both words, at interdisciplinary collaboration. Now, we often hear about interdisciplinary collaboration, that it needs to be rooted in a strong understanding of our disciplinary knowledge. So we need to sort of all come into it with this strong awareness of how we think, why we think the way we do, what's our kind of intellectual history pathway that we're on. But I would also suggest that it's only through interdisciplinary collaboration and interdisciplinary communication and conversation that we can develop that. So it's not that disciplinary knowledge necessarily precedes interdisciplinary communication, it stems from it. And that's what we're trying to generate and demonstrate here today. So, with all of that said, we're going to now commence a series of 5 talks looking at this question of atmosphere. And quite suitably, we're going to start at the intergalactic scale. We're going to think about the fact that the Earth has an atmosphere, rapidly changing one, quite unique, I think we're all here. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Brett Carter, who is a physicist by training and is Deputy Director of the Space Centre, which not just doesn't just reflect the fact he works on outer space, but it stands for Satellite Positioning of Atmospheres, Climates and Environments. Right. Brett, over to you, Brett.
Thank you very much. I'll reach the rescue. Thanks. Okay, so my training was in space physics, but I'm in the geospatial discipline within the School of Science, where lots of interdisciplinary research takes place. I'll grab that. Thank you. There you go. So I thought we'd start off with some images of the atmosphere from space, in particular from the space station. And yeah, music's off, excellent. So to us, the atmosphere is this big thing that we obviously very heavily rely upon, but for the purposes of scientific research, we want to be able to describe it, we want to be able to model it, we want to be able to predict it, we want to be able to, we want to know what impact we are having on it as a species as well. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that lots of things can be described with mathematical equations, fluid mechanics, all this sort of stuff, and the same is true for the atmosphere. That's what gives us our weather predictions for the most part. But it's observations that really make that possible. And we get the vast majority of our observations from space. I'm showing the atmosphere like this now. You can see at night time. The atmosphere doesn't have like a hard rooftop on it. It's not like a really clearly defined boundary between the atmosphere and space. What you can see is the orange sodium line there that indicates approximately 80 to 100 kilometers altitude, and the auroras there are green, typically around 100 k's, and red around 200. And those with keen eyes can actually see other satellites that are up there as well. You can see one up the top there. So this environment itself, we want to understand the whole thing from the ground all the way up and what impacts even the ground has on the atmosphere for these purposes of prediction. And again, it's the case of we don't understand, we can't say we understand something unless we can actually predict it. That's the benchmark for us, or it should be for the most part. So we can, the environment or the atmosphere itself does go up to where the space station is and beyond. It does reach up to about 800 or so kilometers, where the amount of drag being experienced by the satellites is significant. And this is one of those really big issues with us using so many satellites now. We're actually needing to accurately predict what's happening in the upper atmosphere, in addition to being able to predict what's happening closer to the surface where we are. This is, I guess, the atmosphere in its entirety. Notice the log scale on the y-axis here. Well, it's not linear, but everything that most people think of as being the atmosphere is this little part down here, the troposphere. It's where we get our weather. Our planes fly up to altitudes about this high up, and whilst you're only about 10 k's up, 90% of the mass of the atmosphere is actually beneath you when you're up in an aircraft. So if you've got a window seat, have a look up and you'll see it basically turns to black above your head, which is pretty cool. But outside of that, we've got atmospheric layers that we define based on the temperature changes that take place. With the troposphere decreasing and getting colder and colder until we reach the tropopause. Then it warms up again as we reach the stratopause, cools back down again to the mesopause, and then increases up in the thermosphere, which is, I guess, rather appropriately named. And for reference, we've got the auroras there as well as the space station, about 400 kilometres. But ultimately, a lot of our science is directed on trying to understand how these regions interact with one another, and again, from a sense of being able to predict what's going on. So the way we actually do that, particularly within the Space Centre, we very heavily utilise GPS, surprisingly enough. GPS is one of these things that can do lots of things. It can tell you where you are, can give you accurate timing, but it can also be used to measure the water vapour in the air and the electron density up in the ionosphere. And so when we're trying to understand impacts of space weather, so this is literally understanding what impact the sun is having on our atmosphere, we can use GPS to sense it, either from the ground like this, or using GPS receivers on board satellites to effectively sound the atmosphere. And that enables us to map out not only where water vapour is, but also to create these global maps of what the ionosphere is doing all around the world. I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Terrific. So we're having these series of short provocations into different perspectives, and one of the things that really strikes me is how human-centric our normal thinking about the atmosphere is, given that vast physical quantity of it. So next we're going to turn to talk about not just the vertical stratification, but also the horizontal stratification. And so Priya Rajagopalan is a building scientist who's the director of the Sustainable Building Innovation Lab and Associate Dean of Research and Innovation in the School of Property, Construction and Management. And Priya is going to talk about the work that she does sensing different aspects of our atmosphere.
Thank you, Lauren. Okay, I don't know how do I conclude this in 5 minutes or 7 minutes, but I will quickly go through what I have to say. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how the atmosphere in and around buildings, and how does that actually affect people and buildings and people sitting outside the building and also inside the building. So just those who were here in 2019 bushfire, this is a view of how Canberra actually looked, and basically what you see here is the particulate matter, and what is most measurable with our devices, which is not so expensive, but a good indicator for health is PM 2.5, that is particles which are less than 2.5 micrometer. So after 2 years or even a year later, the problem we were all looking at, how do you stop the bushfire fog and pollutants from coming inside the building, what kind of filters we need to provide, how do you make building all airtight so that there is no infiltration of particles and pollutants coming inside. And a year later, the problem completely reversed. It was all about COVID and how do you actually open your windows and get the fresh air coming in. So just some thoughts about how the problems actually change while you are doing research, and how do you address that immediate change in the research problems around you, because you need to be quickly ready to completely change your methodology and try to provide a narrative which is going to be useful to people and make that impact to the public. So I do research into the heating, how urban heat islands and how urban pollution islands actually impact, and how do you actually ameliorate all those issues. So we just heard from Brett how what is happening at that big picture at the atmosphere there. But once it actually reaches the built environment, lot of those solar radiation and things are actually trapped into the buildings in terms of the pavements, in terms of the facade materials, and in terms of the geometry of the street we are actually living inside. And the main pollutions, the sources of pollution, I mean, I can't really separate the meteorology or the temperature or the weather from the pollution, because they both have a lot of connection between each other, because during hot weather the pollutant seems to be more, and then there are more chemical reactions to produce secondary chemicals. And a lot of these issues are human made, like the pollutions are actually happening from human activities in terms of how we are using air conditioning, how we are actually burning fuel, and how we are burning the agriculture waste, and also traffic. A lot of research around urban mobility and pollution. And there are a lot of localized hotspots for heat and pollutants. So what we do is basically, how do you actually address these issues, and how do you make it, I mean, there are a lot of things you can do to reduce the pollution, but once it actually reaches the living environment, what can you actually do in terms of designing the building to reduce that pollution and also coming inside the building? And how does it actually affect the thermal environment is basically what you can see here is how human actually perceive, the radiation, temperature, humidity, the wind speed, and also what kind of activities we are involved in terms of metabolic rate, and also the type of clothing we are wearing. And a lot of studies are around, this you can think about how wind is actually flowing perpendicular to a street canyon. And when you see the ratio between height and width, there are different kinds of flows happening. And depending on the width and height of the street, it could be, the pollutants actually just escaping through the canopy or tunnel, or also it could be actually getting trapped in terms of this situation here. It is just getting recirculated through that narrow canyon. And we do a lot of modeling in terms of physical modeling as well as computer simulation. And in wind tunnel studies, basically we are trying to actually get rid of all these pollutants which is going to be deposited in between those streets. And at the same time, we are using those boundary conditions to see how you can stop those temperature, extra high temperature, and also the pollutants coming inside. And it's very interesting. The problem is very different on locations which are hotter and locations which are close proximity to those pollutant sources. Like, for example, if you remember, like during the COVID, lot of the instructions were about opening the windows in schools and childcare centers, but it's not really possible. Those people living in heavy traffic areas, the solution is completely different in those situations. So again, we try to look at, how do we actually play around with this building geometry? How do you really create, those towers, position those towers so that the wind is channeled and effectively tunneling those wind to disperse the pollutants. So some of the examples we do in computational fluid dynamics modeling is, how do you position your towers? So which is, the high like the really small, like short buildings on the windward side, and the tall buildings away from that wind, so that there is enough opportunity for all buildings to actually get the wind flow and aerodynamic flow in that area. So another issue is anthropogenic heat from residential air conditioning. So what you can see here is, particularly in the hot and humid areas, there is a lot of, now people are becoming more, economically aware, and people are becoming richer, and the poverty is not there anymore, and everybody can afford this air conditioning. But what happens, those heat discharge through this from these air conditioning condensers. Just imagine what happens in this area here. This is a high-rise apartment tower somewhere in Hong Kong. All these condensers are actually discharging heat, and at the same time, this is basically the air is actually coming from. And how hot that air is actually getting, just imagine. And you are taking this fresh air from outside, and the fresh air, every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature in the outdoor air is almost 10% increase in the cooling load. So all this heat is actually getting into the atmosphere, which is creating the problems such as urban heat islands. So it's kind of a the problem just keep increasing and becoming harder and worse and worse. And there is a lot, particularly look at these examples are from India, where people are able to afford, like if you think about 20 years ago, only very rich people used to afford air conditioners, but every house now had 2 or 3 air conditioning units, and no one actually thinks about how much of that heat is getting into the atmosphere. So what do we do? The first important thing is actually doing monitoring. If you really want to know the extent and the seriousness of the problem, you really need to have the monitoring capacity, just like what we are doing here. Try to understand the problem. So this is a free website called Purple Air, which is actually measuring the air quality all around the world. So you could participate, like a citizen science, by purchase one sensor and then put it in your backyard, and then the data using their API actually goes into the website. And the interventions basically we do is much macro scale, particularly about how do you sustainable mobility, reduce the car transport, and also having even in the building itself we have a lot of this rating system. For example, the LEED system, the green star system, where there are real credits for people having the car parks, or even not car parks, sorry, the bicycle stations, showering facilities. So these are all examples of how do you reduce the private vehicles and the pollutants from the city. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Priya, and we're now going to continue our reduction in scale as we become finer and finer scale. Ariel won't multitask. And start to also shift beyond some of the science here and the kind of universal measures to start thinking about it in slightly more qualitative terms, where we start to think about differences as well. And so this is about looking at the ways atmospheres are experienced by different bodies, different groups, but still looking at some of those systemic, structural, patterned approaches, patterns in air quality that Priya talked about. So Margarita Wintris is a PhD candidate in social work. Over to you, Margarita.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will have some notes here. I'm still a novice and neither doctor nor professor yet. So when we talk about atmosphere, I mean, it was interesting just hearing the 2 previous speakers, but atmospheres were always, are a precondition for life, all life on Earth. But increasingly they've also become, I guess, associated with danger, with theft of time, but also with premature death. And in a way, that's part of what my research is about. So what brought me here today and what brought me to my research? I'm currently, like I said, undertaking my PhD in urban heat waves and gendered social vulnerability, and I'm focusing on women who are retirement age, so 65 plus, who live alone in Melbourne, and how they basically experience heat and how they live in, through, around heat, so to speak. I've come into my PhD research myself mainly as a social work practitioner, I've been for most of my adult life, and also as a social movement activist. That's foremost, and academic as a kind of secondary part of that. My own personal experience of quite a few frightening heat waves as a renter in a shitty house, overpriced, that at times had 35 to 36 degrees inside, with a very stingy landlord who didn't want to do anything about it. That was also part of my own personal experience, became also a catalyst for my research. So most of my professional life has been practice-based and social movement orientated, and it's also been precisely that work on a day-to-day basis with people who've experienced the oppressive structures and exploitation, but also their fight against that and for livable lives and livable futures that has really kind of inspired me and has informed also my thinking and also my theoretical position. So basically the kind of perspective that informs my work I would call informed by an eco-socialist feminist perspective. And what keeps me personally also going in our, what I call crisis-infested, very violent system that we are all living in, is a belief in freedom. And this belief is not in a way in an abstract way, but as a way of being and as a place. And as a place, I guess, that's co-created by us and that's for all of us. And a place that guarantees everybody's opportunity to develop to their fullest potential. So for me, seeing, or being in attending to atmosphere and our right to be cool is essentially a labour of love. And it's a vital part of the practical and theoretical work that's required in the construction of this freedom. We're humans living together with the non-human world as a precondition for ongoing future, and I hope that my work can contribute to this. Okay, so the international definition for social work is basically it's a practice-based profession, an academic discipline that promotes social change, development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of all people. Now, the kind of constant construction of deadly atmospheres, because that's what I kind of call it under climate change, actually threatens this mission. We all know that the climate crisis represents the most serious hazard to well-being and global health in the 21st century, and heat wave deaths are considered some of the most detrimental consequences of the ongoing global heating scenario we're living in. And I see maybe some students here from mainland or from China at all, where I just think where people have had some of the most horrendous, ongoing, brutal heat wave, I think, that has ever been recorded. We don't even know yet what the repercussions of this will be for people. Urban environments are particularly vulnerable to heat waves, and Priya has already outlined some of that because of the urban heat island effect, but also the demographics associated. Heat waves have killed more people than all other climate-related hazards combined in Australia, but the actual numbers that are recorded in national mortality statistics are actually underrepresented. That's what recent research has actually found, and they believe they're highly underrepresented, potentially by 50-fold. And I just want to raise this. Is a very interesting study in the Lancet in 2020 by Longden et al. And they reckon that deaths accorded to heat waves actually between 2006 and 2017 could be around 36,000, but they're not recorded as such. And a lot of doctors are now fighting and promoting environmental data to be included in death certificates so we can improve policy responses. Now, of course, this is a particularly important issue for social work, particularly because we're talking about human rights and social justice. But in social work literature, there's actually nothing yet about heat waves, and I'm hoping to change that. People who might be familiar with heat wave might be familiar with some of the work by Eric Klingenberg, who did some brilliant work around the heat wave, in particular the nasty heat wave in Chicago, but also the work of Richard Keller around the 2003 notorious heat wave in Paris that killed over 15,000 people over 2 months. And Eric Klinenberg talks about structurally determined catastrophes with regards to heatwave disasters. He's also the one who coined the term of heatwaves being silent and invisible killers of silenced and invisible people. You might have heard that too. And I think that sentence alone is worthy a PhD to kind of unpack. What we're really saying with this is that the catastrophic dimension of heatwave mortality are concentrated amongst particular population groups and are also higher in particular neighbourhoods. And that exposes the existence of systemic and also spatial inequality. What it also does, it highlights the role of the state in the construction of that risk and the vulnerability to disaster. Older people, so we're talking people 65 plus, make up the vast majority of heatwave victims, with older women overrepresented in international mortality and morbidity statistics. Then the majority of old people identify as women, and the majority of old people are poor. And when we talk about gender here, we're talking about millennia of systemic oppression and exploitation that women have experienced because of inequality in power and specific gender roles. And we're just talking about the engagement of unpaid caring work, but also unpaid paid work. And what it does, it renders them much more at risk of dying or getting sick in heat waves, because they have reduced access to life-preserving resources, such as good housing, good cooling options and transport. And the 2003 Paris heatwave is a very good example of that, and I just want to raise that briefly. Because what it does, it looked also at the accommodation where so many people died. 2/3 of the people who died in that heatwave were women post 65 years of age, and they died in these horrible little places that used to be the maids' quarters, yeah, long time ago. They were just below roofs with tin roofs, and they were basically just frying to death in there. There's no better word to say that. So what Keller did with his work, he looked at accommodation of being places of disaster, but also becoming agents of disaster. So he draws the link between urban geography, such as poor housing, with social biographies of economic disadvantage. So just thinking of my study, which, you know, about 20 women between the age of, the youngest was 67, the oldest was 91. And while each participant had a very unique experience of living through heat and heat waves, what it did also, I could see in their narrative that was developing, that there's convergence at certain points of their experience. And it's particularly around the broader socioeconomic context in which they've experienced their heat waves. We're talking public housing, what it means to live in public housing, which is a stigma, so to speak, and already being stigmatized as being an older woman. We're talking about issues of safety, being able to leave your place and feeling safe to escape the heat. And people making certain decisions. Am I better in my boiling flat, or go to a public cool space where I might potentially get sexually harassed? Or then again, we have a woman who was in her mid-80s who basically ended up going to the train station at 11:30 at night because she felt safer there because it was a bit cooler than in her boiling flat. So there's some very difficult decisions people have to make. Okay, so I guess just to kind of finish off, I just want to raise a couple of final thoughts. One of the key risk factors of also dying in a heat wave is social isolation. So really, in a way, it's important thinking for us about the question of connection, and it's the interdependence for as human beings, which is actually preconditions for and the essence of good life, and not just survival, as we talked before about. And if social connection is missing, there's a higher chance of not surviving, not even having a good life, but not even surviving potentially a heat wave. The climate crisis-induced heat waves are essentially, I think, essentially represent theft of time. Stolen time from humanity's potential life on Earth. And this has increased significance for older people because your life, your span is limited. And it's about being able to treasure the last years of what you've got left. And I want to just finish off with Ramila Thapa. She's an Indian historian who discusses the nexus of aging with the urgency of action. And I want to directly quote her from her essay, A Portrait of Aging. She says, "Those aging are a reminder to the rest of that what needs to be done for the well-being of the human condition, and that has to be done now and right here. Aging brings up the centrality of urgency. Actions should not wait for another day, which other day might never come again. And above all, we still have the right to cherish whatever life is left to us, not as leftover life to kill, but as leftover life to live." Thank you.
Amazing. I don't know who's doing your milestone this week, Margarita, but I think you're going to pass. Extremely impressive. So, there's so many topics already. I hope you're all writing down notes and drawing mind maps and all the different connections. I know from my own work on climate change, I've got a million questions, but I won't intervene yet because we still have two more fascinating speakers who are going to take us into yet further unexplored corners of atmosphere. And we're going to change age groups now and perhaps a slightly more joyous take on atmospheres and sensing of atmospheres. Over to David. So David Rizal, Senior Lecturer, Creative Education in the School of Education.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks everyone for the presentations so far. It's been really interesting to hear about your work. I'm going to talk very quickly about a small project that we did in Hume, and an urban neighbourhood of the city of Manchester in the UK, multi-ethnic neighbourhood with a lot of social housing, and work we did with a group of children aged 5 to 11 from a community arts centre called Zion Arts that provides free arts programming for children in the neighbourhood for like the last 20-25 years. This is one of about 15 different projects that I've worked on collaboratively with children and young people in cities around the world. So it's part of a larger kind of ongoing program of research around reimagining cities in response and under conditions of climate change through collaborative work with local communities. I wanted to start by kind of defining a little bit about how we're thinking about this notion of affective atmospheres in our work. So this is from a chapter in a book called Speculative Geographies that just came out last year that I wrote about this project, The Listening Body, with my colleagues Michael Gallagher and Mark Wright. So we're really thinking about atmospheres both in terms of their meteorological elemental forces and the intensive affects and sensations that are part of that meteorological space-time. So if you think about like intensive forces as forces of subjectivity, emotion, feeling, thought, concepts, images, not to separate those, but actually to think of them together, and what kind of methods or methodologies might issue from that. So how we're interested in how affective atmospheres, kind of at the scale of a neighborhood or even a city or a street or a place where people gather, and we're also taking a more than human approach. So we're not just focusing on the human elements, but actually how they are imbricated with more than human relational and ecological affects and movements and forces. So we're thinking about atmospheres in this way as by nature unstable, and so they have a kind of meta-stability that is dynamically changing, so they're always shifting, but they can also have this tendency to linger and accumulate and return, so similar to some of the things you mentioned, Marguerite, about structural inequalities that hover around a particular location. There's this sense as well that affective atmospheres, they involve the formation of a kind of provisional or porous boundary condition. So they're not just like reaching out everywhere, but they are dispersed, and that those kind of dispersals that are held by a provisional membrane or boundary are subject to continuous variation extrusion and rupture. So in a way, it's kind of closer to a topological view of atmosphere rather than a strictly geometric view. And in this sense, it troubles linear concepts of space and time. It's multi or trans-scalar, multi-temporal, and disrupts determinate boundaries between bodies and environments. So it's not looking at things and objects as just beings that are discrete, but actually how their pasts and futures and presence are kind of generating a collectively configured atmosphere. So I'm going to just walk through this project and its methodology. I thought that would be the best way to just very quickly give a sense of what the project, how it worked and what it did. So we started by introducing children to atmospheric sensing through a playful series of sound walks through their local urban environments. So this was about listening, but listening in an expanded sense, so not just with our ears, but kind of with our whole bodies, but also listening with a number of different media and digital technologies. So biometric wristbands that capture electrodermal skin activity that kind of senses affective charges in the body, blood volume pulse, motion, acceleration, temperature. We use GPS as well as particulate matter sensors for sensing air pollution as we moved around the city. We used GoPro cameras that were chest mounted and very, very sensitive microphones as well. So we were kind of like this collective moving assemblage of bodies and sensing technologies that together were kind of generating an image of the affective atmospheres of the spaces we were moving through. So after that initial series, we worked with children as researchers, so we worked collaboratively with them to begin mapping how they were sensing the atmospheric qualities of the different environments around Hume, and that became the basis for them designing their own walks. So, you know, we were looking at the data that had been generated through the walks, and as well as the kind of subjective experience, and then using maps to kind of annotate and give them the opportunity to then decide how they wanted to walk and sense their neighborhood, but also develop ways of kind of changing or intervening or disrupting spaces that they might feel were, you know, needed to be shifted in some way. So some of the examples of the sound walks that they came up with involved going to their local school after hours when the teachers were supposedly kind of marking or evaluating their work and rattling the fences. So we have all of this on video from kind of child perspectives. And the other piece that was interesting, because our university campus had just kind of helicoptered into this neighborhood and built this fantastic new building like this in the middle of a multi-ethnic space. So they had never entered this university campus, and part of this particular project was about us working with literally the kids who lived around where we worked, and opening up new ways for community to have agency within the university. And so what they wanted to do was get these balloons and enter the university campus for the very first time and screech the balloons like crazy and disrupt all of the lectures, all the research, everything that was going in there. So yeah, we had this kind of moving assemblage of kids throwing off everything in the university space, and we made a film about this. It was all captured by children from GoPro cameras. So yeah, this is just kind of a very quick example of what some of that footage looked like, where you're literally following these balloons as they move through. And so we really, in the chapter I referenced, we're thinking about balloons as atmospheric objects and how, in a way, you know, the event, the balloon starts to kind of shift and direct the event in some way that isn't human-centered. And the balloon is actually kind of sensing and changing the affective atmospheres of the spaces that they're going through. And so we theorize this in terms of a kind of micropolitics that is driven by children's kind of political desire to disrupt and enact playful experiments in you know, higher education or pedagogical spaces. this is kind of was the last phase of this particular project, which was really bringing all the data, all of the imagery, all of the experiences that we've had together in a large kind of gallery space in the Zion Arts Center. And basically all the walls were covered with maps of the neighborhood. We had projections of things that, the imagery and films that children had created. We had sound playing in there. We had the bio data, we had the air pollution data, and we just basically worked creatively with all that, bio and geographical and audiovisual data to create an immersive space for thinking together with children about the sonic geographies of their city and their kind of future imaginaries around what that could become and how their the methods and ways of thinking with and through sound and listening that we'd explored could be kind of an agent of transformation in that neighborhood. So I'll just finish there. This is just some recent work I've published on atmospheres if anyone's interested. I realize, this book here is actually out now, so if people are interested, I have a copy there if you want to have a look. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you so much, David. And I think that starts to really point to the way that atmospheres is very much associated with this sense of belonging as we walk through different spaces and we try to sense what's going on. And it reminds me of something I read recently around this experiment they did in a lab space where they brought dogs in and they played them recordings of wolves howling. And dogs that are genetically far distant from their ancestors, the wolves, all seem to have this great stress reaction of breaking out in all sorts of signs of bodily stress, and some of them even howled back, not being howlers, but they howled back. And what that pointed to was this bodily sense of the dogs actually thinking they were suddenly heading in, somehow stumbled into a wolf's territory. And that idea of suddenly realising through an atmospheric kind of sense that we're somehow somewhere we don't belong and are in danger. When you think about that in the city and the way in which we're constantly sensing and trying to teach children to be alert to signs of things, maybe they need to leave that train carriage, maybe they need to go somewhere else. And so that's part of it, and so it's kind of, we've talked about the physics, the chemistry of it, but it's also the ways our bodies, even without us thinking about it, are sensing the atmosphere all the time. Anyway, so now we are in a workplace, and so it's only fitting that we talk about workplace atmospheres. We're going to talk further about this idea of the collective experience, which is underlying the idea of affective atmospheres. And so last but not least, we have Julian Waters-Lynch, who's a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship over in the College of Business and Law, School of Management, to finish our trifecta of college perspectives on atmospheres. Over to you, Julian.
We're going to do a panel talk after this, right? Yeah. So when I was coming in on the train this morning, I was imagining sitting on a panel cross-legged sort of roofing. I didn't realise I'd be standing up speaking, but I'm going to endeavour time-wise to stick to 5. Yeah, unusual in academia. That was fun, and it was kind of nice to follow because I could see people starting to smile when they saw the kids. And it set up the way I think about atmospheres quite well in terms of that affective atmosphere literature. I really have got two points here. I want to talk about the past research I've done and how I came to get interested in these ideas, and then how I think about it moving forwards. 10 years ago, Margaret, I was a PhD student too, and my topic empirically was these co-working spaces at the time, which were fairly novel. Now they've become much more standardised, but people hadn't heard of them very often back then. This is Hub Melbourne, the famous ballroom. Hub's now got 15 of these, and they look a lot more like these offices. And so I went in not really knowing what I was doing as a beginner, going, well, what's going on in these places, right? I didn't take a theoretical position as an ethnographer doing grounded theory. But it seemed two things were happening. There was something about the spatial design themselves, and I use that term expansively, not just literally the room design, but the lighting. They played music. They arranged plants in certain ways. There was at the time a kind of bohemian aesthetic to the design. Often and part of that was resource constrained, frankly, but it was also trying to lure the hipsters in and say, this space is different, right? This is cool. And actually, to your point about practice and the sort of participation, a lot of these things, I hadn't thought about this for a while, were designed by the community members themselves. It wasn't just a business that said, hey, we're going to fill this room with stuff, come in. So they're encouraging that level of participation and creation. And the other lens I had looking at it was social practices, which is pretty standard, or a long tradition in social science. Lots of people have written about how kind of activities become ritualized and routinized in these recognized forms of practice. And when I was interviewing people, they would say on one level, well, it's not really the space, it's getting to talk to other people, it's meeting interesting people. People are particularly open in the space and interesting. And then they often would say things like, but at the end of the day, it's just kind of the vibe of this place. There's something about this place, right? And so I was working with this sort of space practice conundrum for a while, and then this literature on atmospheres from Ben Anderson, but also older folks like, my German's not very good, Gernot Böhmer, right? Had been writing about this term in social science, the utility of this concept of atmospheres as bringing together in some ways these, I would say, three things that I think are useful in the context of co-working in other workplaces. Objective features of the environment. So this room to me has a certain kind of mood, right? It's like maybe a little bit tired. But the mood of the room, it's, if you think about where that comes from, as a, it's something to do with the light, it's something to do with that vague buzzing. If we were playing jazz, musicals may be different. It's something to do with the power dynamic of me standing up here with a microphone. It's what's happening in the room in a human sense, but it's also this sensory amalgam of different forces, right? So it's objective, but it's also got the utility of atmosphere is it's not completely objective, but we also bring this subjective experience to it. The colours mean different things to different people. They have different associations based on their culture or personal history, right? Whether this is intimidating or whatever your historical relationship with a room like this is, that will have an influence. So they bring together this objective and subjective quality, but also importantly, they bring together a temporal quality. So the same place can have very different moods, like that campus you're talking about, when kids are rattling cups outside when someone's trying to mark and going, why the hell did, whose research idea was this? It'll have a different mood to, when the students are there the first day, the university or a church can have a very different mood, whether it's celebrating a wedding or mourning a funeral, right? So I found this a useful concept to bring together to describe the kind of buzz and activity that people were talking about in these spaces. And one more slide. Now, how that's, whatever we're describing there, and I think the ontological status is kind of indeterminate, little fuzzy, and I think that's why people that write about this often use this sort of poetic language that you put up, right? Some of that's useful, some of that's hard when you go into management and entrepreneurship, you're writing about innovation, right? Because it can seem sometimes overtly impressionistic. And it's like, well, what do you actually do with that, right? So one of the things I did is I looked back at the history of economic geography. In fact, I've lost track of time. 2 more minutes? Yeah. Here I went. I thought I'd be disciplined, and then I got I got enraptured with my own. What I found is at certain points in history, especially where there's zones of new technology emerging, like a classic one is the special industrial atmospheres of the late 19th century in Northern England. Alfred Marshall, Daddy Mac of economic geography, I don't know if that's an un-PC term now, Daddy Mac, but anyway, wrote a lot about it. But he would describe, he said, it's like there's something in the air of these places, in Manchester and Liverpool. The mysteries of the trade become no longer mysteries. He said they're in the air, right? People, if you go, another rich, interesting place for this is in the late 70s, there was something called Homebrew Computer Club, right? So this is where famously Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met each other. But at the time, I mean, there wasn't really a market for personal computers. So these engineers would turn up to this club at Stanford and they'd swap it, they'd share information, they'd swap design. And then when you read the literature on that time, at the time they'd say, well, then we'd all go to this pub called Oasis, and there were these wooden carvings, and we'd have beer, and we'd we'd share ideas. Another really similar example was in Silicon Valley in the 80s. There was this famous restaurant called the Wagon Wheel, that's what it's called, got it. And people would describe, well, we'd go there and we were working for competitor organizations, but we'd put all that aside, we'd have a few beers, and then we'd basically just share problems and try and solve them. So this sort of organic environment of open innovation. No commentary on whether Silicon Valley is good or stupid. That aside, I'm sure this room will have plenty of critiques. But the point that's interesting about this to me is that, I mean, one of the fundamental, I guess, theories of innovation is information exchange, right? Schumpeter famously said, innovation is about novel combinations of ideas. And we know that in cities, in particular parts of cities, they outperform in productivity and innovation, largely, so far as we can tell, because people exchange information. They get together. But what I would propose is that information exchange doesn't happen in a vacuum, to extend the metaphor. It happens through these atmospheres that can either facilitate or inhibit these. And that is a concept. I don't think it's been fully articulated or particularly well articulated in management thinking or even entrepreneurship and innovation. So anyway, going forward, I mean, that's how I think about atmospheres as a sensory amalgam. They can either encourage, facilitate, sort of moderate productive information transfer or exchange, or they can inhibit it. And we've all walked into a room in a meeting at work or something, where you go, oh, this isn't a safe space to ask a question, right? Or this isn't a safe space to challenge a view. And that's usually unproductive when we come to solving problems. So that's, I guess, how I think about it and my interest in it.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's a perfect note to complete the presentations on, because we are exactly trying to create a vibe, mood, where it's safe to ask questions, come and actually have intellectual exchange. So could I ask my panelists to come up here? Ari, we might turn that off just because the blue light is killing the vibe. Sits down here.
We grab seats?
Grab seats and bring them across. We don't have beers, but. So what I'd really encourage everyone here to do is to think about the ways in which perhaps atmosphere features unexplained and quietly in your own work, or perhaps more from a kind of
Yeah, where do you want to sit? All the way across?
right, yeah. Or perhaps more where your work is positioned in relationship to the smorgasbord of ontologies and epistemologies and methodologies that we just saw played out in front of us, without sort of getting too ologied into it. I think it's pretty clear that we have some pretty sort of different, but I would agree to say complementary perspectives on understanding these atmospheres that we're part of. And so I wanted to just start by asking our panellists about the different scales of work at which they work, and whether, in thinking about what we heard from the other speakers, whether there was any gaps in your work, any aspects of your work that you thought, goodness, I could actually really incorporate another aspect of something into it. Understanding that it's impossible to incorporate everything. Julian?
Well, less a gap, but the thing that I was struck with, Brett, isn't it, when you were talking about modelling the complex systems, you made the claim that we don't fully understand something unless we can predict it, which is, I'm happy to sign off in natural sciences. I think that's right, in the relationship. It's a more provocative statement in social sciences.
Oh, yeah.
But rather than get into the social science question, I'm curious about that, because I've heard also people say, scientists say, we don't have a mathematics that can adequately, predictably model complex and chaotic systems, especially when they're open. So I was hoping you'd respond a bit more to that.
Yeah, so I think even what I said can be a little bit provocative for some inside the natural sciences, because I think we have, especially in space, where something strange will happen on the sun, and a collection of people, of scientists, would be like, no, we understand that. But then those of us that are around were like, well, did you tell us that was going to happen? And the answer is no. And it's like, well, you don't understand it then. So it's a bit of an ongoing dispute that we all have. But I guess from our perspective, sometimes the mathematics is wrong. but a lot of time the data that you've driven with the mathematics is incomplete. And so this is, I guess, one of the issues with weather forecasting. We can only see a few days ahead of time. Measurement errors are part of that issue, but another part of it is that you're not seeing everything that you need to, not taking into account things like urban hot areas, the impacts on much smaller scales that people are having on the environment itself. And so these I guess, aberrations grow with time, and that's why we can only forecast 1 to 2 weeks out reliably, depending on what it is you want to forecast. But yeah, we like to sort of box things into these complicated environments into, okay, well that's that one, and in order to map that to this one, then we need, like for example, the magnetosphere. We have a magnetosphere model. We literally just bolt that onto the top of the atmosphere model with a bit of a thread. This is how we think these two things communicate with one another. This is how they interface, and then we explore that and push it forward. And so I think it's only been recently we've actually got models to go from the lower atmosphere up to the thermosphere, and even then they're not right. We need to figure out why and tweak it accordingly. Is that sort of along the lines of what you're looking for?
Certainly enough for now. Actually, if we have more time, I'd be digging in, but yeah, let's go.
And well, just to build on that while others think, one of the things that really strikes me about satellites, sensors in buildings, bodies, is we're all in the atmosphere as much as we're trying to research the atmosphere. So if you recall on my opening slide, I had an image of a fish in water. What I wanted you to concentrate on was the actual white space above that. So we can see water. So there's always that famous saying, fish don't know they're in water. Well, it's like, it's harder for us to see, we can see the water, but it's harder for us to see the atmosphere. It also means that, in this time of turbulent change, climate change amongst it, we are vulnerable to the effects that we're also perhaps trying to study. And so, just with the satellites and the building sensors, are there issues where the physical effects of the local atmospheres are actually interrupting and disrupting the ability to sense and communicate data about the atmospheres? Because I personally sort of see a future where perhaps, we just suddenly become blind to everything because our ability to sense things is actually undermined.
Yeah, a little bit. It's sort of getting into politics and probably closer to everyone else's areas than mine, but we have, up until relatively recently, the governments particularly the US and European Union and Japan and many others, their satellites have been tasked with weather forecasting, and for organisations like the Bureau, they can just grab that data and use it. It's fast becoming the case now that this is becoming commercialised, and so companies are taking away this capability from the governments and selling it back to them. And this, so much of our protest within these communities where we see this happening, this is creating a big problem in the sense that if the countries that can afford this data, they can put it into their weather forecasting models, which obviously impact people down on the ground. More so than in other places, it actually raises some really serious concerns about the democratization of space, and even in the context of what's been happening with Elon Musk's rolling out an absolutely ridiculous number of satellites in a short period of time. It's pretty well understood that this is a big problem for us, but this is one of those really messy situations where someone just needs to sort it out. It's going to impact people more and more, and this is one of the bigger concerns that those of us that get bogged down with a lot of the technical stuff get worried about.
Can I just add? Yeah. I think your question about the gap, like what I'm very much interested, and I'm always thinking about that. Like in our discipline, okay, so a person standing, in a spot here under the shade of a tree, like you can say like 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter, okay, and that is the scale of things. That person moves from there to this spot completely. The thermal comfort, the atmosphere change because they are exposed to sun, and there is no enough wind flow because And the research like Brett is talking about, it is at that scale, like, and what is that resolution, where you can really bring that from that top, like hundreds of kilometers resolution to a 0.5 resolution. And the more you think about that, the even the computing facilities we need for simulation for that big area is enormous. And again, I don't know there is an answer, but I'm really trying to find that sweet spot about what is that resolution we need to bring these two disciplines together to get a reasonable answer to the questions and get it done, very quickly with the machineries we have, and which becomes, equally useful for all the disciplines. Yeah.
I guess maybe building on that, it was actually just what I was thinking about. In terms of large-scale projects driven by the natural sciences, which is what sucks up most of the research money, whether in Australia or around the world. But in the EU, we see with the Horizon Grant program, which is funding the major scientific research across Europe, now there's a requirement to include a social science component on those projects. So I haven't been successful, but I've been on a couple of Horizon EU projects where I was working with scientists on indoor air quality or on greenhouse gases and the preservation of conservation areas across Europe, where it was, scientists working together from different disciplines of natural sciences, and then folks like me coming in to design a socially engaged component of that project that actually works with community to translate the science into impact and knowledge within communities. So in a very concrete sense, like one of the projects was on indoor air quality in hospitals, sensors going through the whole thing, simulations, what do they call those things, where they create a double of the hospital and digital twin, all of this like crazy science and tech stuff. But it all came down to the question of how does this actually impact people who work in the hospitals and people who are in the hospitals for care? We can have all the data we want, but without the actual social component of this project, it's just data. So I guess, it's kind of raising that question of can we imagine projects where, like projects that you are both working on, where a social research perspective and the latest innovation, I guess, in social research could actually be included and able to be contributing to those problems.
Short answer, I think yes. It's just that we haven't been motivated enough to really think about it like that.
I'll ask for questions from the audience in a sec, but Marcelina?
Yeah, look, I just find this whole conversation fascinating, and some of it is, completely not my area at all, but I can see the absolute interconnectedness of it all. And so much of it is actually a political question. The fact what we can access to sustain life, what research we need to sustain life, is a political question. I keep coming back to that. And just even thinking, so for instance, an example for me is you were talking about community and accessing the university, yeah? And kind of, what did you call it? Open the university to community to have agency in this space. So, and I'm briefly talking about heat waves. When, heat waves are coming up, government, everybody says, stay cool, close the doors, do this and this and that. If you cannot stay safe at home, go to a public cool space, yeah? A library or this or that. There's no extra funding that comes from the Commonwealth that supports these places to be able to be open. Becomes a local kind of a council issue. Now, I don't know if you're aware that universities are not considered public cool places. Nowhere is, for instance, RMIT advertised to the community to say, why don't you all come here? The homeless people, the people who are boiling at home, come here. We've got all this space here. So I'm just thinking there are opportunities, I think, for maybe some of us to actually talk about how we can combine our work around atmospheres, around, urban planning, all sorts of things to actually create real benefit in the here and now for people. And just a quick one, Priya also, Priya raised this whole question about the maladaptive strategy of individual air conditioning, yeah? Absolutely. But what do people do who live in a house that they cannot retrofit, that's way too expensive to make safe in living, they cannot go somewhere because they mightn't have a car, they can't go to universities or go to public school space. What do we also do in the here and now? And I think these are the tensions we have to work with. And again, it becomes, I think, a political question of, you know, having industry standards, all of that, building standards, I don't know the right language, you know what I mean? To actually make people be safe in their place.
I think there is a lot of things happening around in that area, that energy efficiency and retrofitting houses, because we are quite very well ahead in terms of new buildings. Those who are in the building space, you may have heard about the National Construction Code 2022 requiring all new buildings to be 7-star standard, which is considered, you know, not bad, but far behind the European standards. But the question is, what do we do with those, I think 1.8 million existing houses, which are created, which are built probably pre-1990 when there was no energy efficiency standard. And then the question about the rental housing, because there is, you know, the owners are never interested because they are not going to get the benefit of that. For them, the cheapest build, the cheapest money, the maximum rent. And there are obviously examples from recently in 2022 September, France. What they have done is you can't rent a house if it is, you know, they have a rating of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and A means the best, G is the worst. So if you can't, if your house is below G and F, you can't rent it. It is illegal to rent. So there are best practice examples, which again it's a political issue, and all the governments are trying to work together. But again, you know, it's a whole lot of who is responsible is the Commonwealth, state government, the local governments. So it's an interesting area, but I think everyone has to work together for that, and it's a question about, you know, who is gaining out of it. But yeah.
And I think bringing in this, you know, really useful perspective about seeing the university as part of this. I mean, the community you speak of who's hot, I mean, in poor condition. I mean, that's, you know, a lot of university students and staff too, right? I mean, this is not a distant issue. And
Well,
you know,
today, isn't it? Don't we have a heat wave in Melbourne today and tomorrow? And then,
yeah, that's right.
Not an
Yeah.
extreme one, yeah. But,
And here we are.
Exactly, I was just
Particularly
thinking that.
cold.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Turned it up because we were.
Yeah. But you know, part of it is, you know, thinking through all of the connections. So, you know, like if we just do a little thought experiment that, you know, we now live in a very distributed workplace. You know, we're here today. It's a bit unusual to have an in-person event like this. You know, we're all around different spaces, experiencing difficult conditions. How does that affect our, you know, productivity is the catchphrase, but basically ways of thinking, ability to think. How does that, you know, affect the way that we are able to connect with colleagues, think, you know, outside of the easy ways of thinking, stretch our minds. You know, there is kind of a kind of cognitive impact to this as well, that I think we need to really, you know, recognise and start to address actively as well. And we're doing that. We've got some colleagues here, Carolina from the Climate Resilience Living Lab, where we're literally trying to not just do research on climate resilience, but think through how we are living it out through our research as well. But I want to turn to the audience to see if there's any comments or reflections or questions that this has perhaps prompted about your own research, or any questions directly for our panellists. Sorry, it is a kind of stare into space kind of topic. Yeah, and it is. Yeah, Cameron.
Yeah, I'll jump into that. First thing to say, fantastic panel. Really wonderfully curated, the order of the speakers. And so partially the question is, there seems to be a logic in the panels that we move in a scalar way from the planetary to the lived and felt. You know, and so the question of scale seemed to work its way through each of the presentations. And it seems like in my mind there's a relationship between scale and politics. becomes political at that scale-up point where we start to feel it. So we feel climate change in the upper atmosphere as we feel the heat wave in Melbourne today. We feel the politics of climate change in our apartments, in our places of dwelling, as we come to experience the effects of climate change and we're impacted by climate change. Or, ideally at work, when opportunities for play, when the kids run through the building and all of us are pulled out of our grumpy professor headspace into, okay, this work is for other people, and we should perhaps remember that a bit more, and maybe having kids in the building would be a nice reminder of that from time to time.
That's the optimistic take.
That's the optimistic take. Yeah, I'm thinking about my kids are at school at the moment, and I'm really glad they're at school and they can stay. So I wanted to ask the panel about that notion of scale, because it seems like measuring scale or making sense of scale is this really intriguing problem with atmospheres, right? That you started with planetary. We know that there's distinctions between we've learned to make distinctions between different scales within the atmosphere. So we draw distinctions, but you said it's not like you call it hard and fast ceiling, right? There's no, we have conceptualized these distinctions. We can map them, and that was a fantastic map of that. But we know that it's not as if there's a hard boundary of one finishes and the other starts. And this seems to be true of all atmospheres, right? That we know that they can't extend forever, because then the notion of atmosphere is not particularly conceptually analytically interesting. So we know that there's a atmosphere inside this room that differs when we leave, so we can think about scale as well. Does the scale end at the door? So I know this is a question without an answer, but just be interesting to hear you talk about how do we think about scale and boundaries, because it seems like there's an interesting question around, well, the boundary of my building becomes political if it's comfortable for me inside, that the boundary outside the building, should I care about older people dwelling in housing in Melbourne where they're unsafe? Politically, of course I should. I mean, you care because that's part of your social work degree, but also that's kind of the goal of the reason why we conduct research, right, is that we care about this stuff.
Yeah, we're all getting older.
And
We're all getting older.
And just to add a kind of research-oriented addendum to that too, like, do you ever feel like the truthfulness of the research you do faces some kind of spatial limit?
Yeah,
like
totally,
it's true up until a point, and then actually we don't know.
I'm happy to take a first step. I should have said Cameron and I have worked together on these topics too, so if I wasn't so conscious of the 5 minutes, I would have acknowledged that. I thought about this question a lot in terms of the utility of the concept, so in social science particularly. So we have these other words like culture, or in climate is one that's used in, say, organizational studies. And what's interesting, what I notice is sometimes over-eager academics, they latch onto a concept and then they want to expand it very capaciously to apply to everything. And atmosphere seems to be one of a concept that has that potential, where people start to look at everything in this way.
Affect is the same, right?
Yeah, affect, just like you see it everywhere, or practice. Everything's a practice, right? So there is this Maslowian hammer and nail aspect. I mean, I've got sort of integrative instincts in the sense that I like to try and work out how concepts might fit together. Other people don't. I'm not saying it's the way to do it. So the way that I've thought about this useful, like, it does make kind of sense to say, well, the city has an atmosphere about it, but usually I've operationalized it more thinking about what's the environment that's immediately impacting my senses, as distinct from, and I've used that quite specifically in thinking about organizations, as distinct from the longer duration of culture. Right? In fact, there's one paper that makes this distinction between atmosphere at the local sort of climate as lingering a little longer, and then culture as this much harder to change aspect. Plenty to say on the politics, but I'll save that. That's the way I think about it.
Thanks, Julian. Anyone else aware of the limits of what you're saying in terms of the scale?
Well, yeah, I'm interested to jump in around that question of the political scale, because I guess what a panel like this perhaps urges us to do is actually think the political at the planetary scale. And so this is kind of this idea that science is in itself political, that the sensors that are embedded in the air are doing political work. So it's not that it only becomes political now when we talk about it in this space or in a local context. So work like Jennifer Gabrius on kind of the computational planet and the programmable Earth, work on the Anthropocene, it's almost, I think, edging towards this new epoch in which we're talking about a planetary politics. And when we're thinking about, those satellite images as deeply political images, and talking about arrays of sensors and the data that they're generating, even outside of our knowledge, right?
Just to touch on Jules's point, the idea of if atmosphere is sensed, then that sensory array massively expands that sensory boundary, right? The idea is now we can sense at the planetary scale these lovely satellites, that great YouTube clip that you started with, where we've got, we can sense the aurora in a fundamentally different way that's been impossible in the history of our species up to this point, right? So that kind of, the boundary of that sensing, that sensed capacity is massively expanding.
Yeah,
For some.
Exactly. Yeah, I have a paper with Elizabeth DeFreitas and Niels Jaeger around politics of ubiquitous sensation, which is precisely about this kind of dispersal of sensory ecologies, really, at the planetary scale, and how this becomes a kind of ubiquitous political sensory condition. But the argument as well is that a lot of what is being sensed is outside of the human, and it's not just kind of action reaction simple sensing, particularly with AI, and taking that data and configuring it in ways that even can prefigure futures, so that where prediction comes in. It's actually the politics of that is that we have technological sensory arrays that are making decisions about the future without us even having any agency in it. And that changes the atmospheres of the here and now of what we're actually doing and talking about. So that I think scale can be a bit of a red herring as well if we keep thinking about it in kind of geometrical terms, because the politics stretch logically across scale.
Can I just pick up? So one of the tensions I think between the sorts of different fields of research. One is a biological reading of the human, and there are literal biological requirements which help us determine what is safe and what's dangerous. At the same time, of course, with this huge differences in experience and qualitative experience, and so while certain levels of carbon dioxide will just about guaranteed to kill us, what counts as, I'll say, cold rather than hot. What counts as cold, is a hotly argued point in most households. I'll say it's cold. So I think there's kind of an interesting kind of tension there to actually work with as well. And I do feel sometimes as someone in the sort of more social science humanities, there's been a little bit of skepticism about some really hard biological realities that actually are really true. And I wondered particularly, maybe Margarita, in your work, because it feels like you sort of sit into that tension that you're doing an interpretive piece of work, so you're asking people about their experiences of heat, and yet I think you're very attentive to the actual, you talked about death, the actual realities of biological limits of the human body as well. How do you negotiate that? Because it's quite different readings of the human.
Well, how do we negotiate that? I guess partly it's about understanding that as humans, there's biology and there's kind of, how shall I say, it's the body and mind is very much interconnected. I don't know how to better say it. So we know there's real concrete limits to, for instance, heat. There's only so much heat we can take. We'll die. We'll just die. That's our physiology. But at the same time, our lived experience, and that's why I had Simone de Beauvoir first, it's also how we experience certain things as humans is different, depending on our gender, our social location, on so many things. So the fact that more women, older women, die in heat waves, there's a reason for that, and a multitude of reasons, longer life expectancy, but it could also be not having access to life-saving resources because of gender discrimination. So I think it's being aware again of how you're located in this unequal society that creates creates the vulnerability for you. We all have a biological limit, but then what exposes you to more risk is socially created. And my issue with that is, okay, it's a socially created, again, like climate change, yeah, but then how you have to survive and what you do becomes your individual responsibility. So that's when this idea of resistance, you're just going to come up with resistance and deal with it. And I think, so these are some of the things. But just another thing I wanted to kind of think about is this importance of interconnectedness. With all our work we do, everything we do, of humans, with the modern human world, and that interconnectedness of people, because if you are socially isolated, you die younger, basically. So, and that's in a way not biological, so to speak. It's very, I don't know how else to explain it. So, yeah. So it's about understanding, I guess, the social elements of good life, or that gives you life, or that threatens life, together with the biological. You cannot distinguish them completely, I think. That's a long-winded answer.
Well, so just in the last few minutes, I just want to sort of, draw attention to the sort of mental image that you might sort of start to use to help connect all of these different scales and different sort of spaces. And I think the notion of work, and particularly research work, is really helpful here. So if we, centre ourselves in this air-conditioned room, performing a social practice known as panelling, collaborating, this is very much something that makes sense to us but wouldn't make sense in other workplaces or cultures. It's very much a practice with a good vibe, I hope. In a university where we're immune to the disruptive effects of those on the street just outside here, who may or may not feel like they belong, just to sort of pick up the two bits here. But then, also relying here on all of the computing, so not just the building machines that are generating heat in the basement in order to keep us cool, but of course the computing, which is of course deeply connected to data centres and satellites. So right now, what we're doing is we're in active communication with a range of satellites just to kind of be within this technologically enabled building and environment right here. Meanwhile, talking about things that have real world impacts that will or won't give voice to different groups, marginalised groups like older women, which will or won't have effects that benefit some and not others. So, I think we're sort of really, entangled, to use a very trendy social science word, in all of this. And part of it is because this notion of atmosphere is one in which we cannot escape. There's literally very few aspects of the world which are so integral to everything we do. So to actually have 5 researchers here researching atmospheres, I think is particularly fruitful. So with that, I think I will call this to a close, and thank you so much for being courageous enough to come to what must have been quite an intriguing kind of title. Big thank you to our panellists for being courageous enough and for being up for coming for this also open-ended discussion, and really encourage you to engage with the rest of the Urban Futures Symposium as well. And thanks and good luck to all our HDRs. Thank you. Yes, and what have our collective bodies done to the chemistry of this room?
Yeah, but there is, one point I want to make. If you have this data without understanding, we talk about big data, AI, etc., without looking at the metadata. So one thing, the CO2 level, carbon dioxide concentration level is 589 with, maybe 20, 30 people, but probably this room is designed for much more number of people, so the occupancy level is not that, high. And one thing you need to remember is the door was opened, it was not meant to be, the door was meant to close, and how much energy is actually getting wasted by the cold air is probably deposited to the corridor. So it's again another, what is optimum, the comfort, air quality, or energy?
Or shared air.
We held it relatively stable.
Yeah, it was
It was about the same.
And
when we
again,
started talking.
we are
Thank you,
here,
machines.
most of the people are there, so the location of the sensor is again.
Here we go, see?
Thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.